Debates about how best to prevent exploitation in international clinical research are hampered by entrenched disagreement regarding the content of the moral wrong of exploitation. Despite this theoretical dispute, there is widespread agreement that there exists a subset of wrongfully exploitative interactions which are both fully consensual and beneficial to all the parties involved. For example, sweatshop labor is often taken to be paradigmatic of exploitation, but labor agreements in the developing world look procedurally fair. Laborers and employers both offer valid consent to the transaction, and all of the parties seem to benefit as compared to their pre-transaction baseline. The charge of wrongful exploitation, then, seems to refer to the fairness of the distribution of the social surplus of a transaction, or maybe to some other feature of a transaction, but not to its procedural fairness, or procedural features, I should say. Moreover, many controversial instances of clinical research conducted in lower and middle income countries, or what I'll shorthand as LMICs, can fall into this category. Research sponsors are not deceiving host communities into participating in research, and host communities and trial participants benefit relative to their pre-transaction baselines. They often receive medical care they otherwise could not access, increased local healthcare capacity, or other forms of compensation. Nevertheless, many feel that certain clinical trials are wrongfully exploitative and should not be permitted. Now, discussions of exploitation in international research focus largely on whether such research is exploitative and on what types or amounts of benefits to host communities would suffice for non-exploitative arrangements. Less explicit attention has been devoted to the equally important question of whether some third party would be morally justified in enforcing substantive limits to international research transactions in order to reduce exploitation. Policymakers at the NIH and bioethicists have tended to suggest that substantive limits on otherwise exploitative agreements would be unjustified if those agreements were entered into voluntarily and were beneficial to all of the parties involved. So those who reject the legitimacy of exploitation, who I'm going to call liberals about exploitation or just LAEs, suggest that interference with fully voluntary research transactions is a violation of the autonomy of host communities and also research sponsors. And I argue that this defense is grounded in a principle of respect for autonomy which fails to account for underlying structural features of the relationships which inform research transactions. In doing so, I hope to demonstrate that the principle of respect for autonomy is insufficient to capture the value of agency as relevant to the kinds of transactions we're looking at. And specifically, I'm talking about research transactions conducted under severe threat advantage. And I go on to argue that the neo-Republican notion of non-domination is a more appropriate framework for the ethical assessment of research interactions conducted within the context of the global economic system. Throughout this discussion, I follow those with whom I'm engaging and take it for granted that a transaction which is procedurally fair may nevertheless be exploitative or unfair in terms of its substance, and that at least some international research transactions fit this description. And throughout the paper, when I talk about host communities, or if I just say communities, what I mean to refer to is developing world host communities and research participants. So, in the rest of the paper, I'm going to briefly sketch the liberal case for non-intervention in international clinical research transactions, and I'm going to critically examine in particular the principle of respect for autonomy as it informs the liberals' position. Next, I'll propose an alternative means of assessment for international research transactions, grounded in the neo-Republican notion of freedom as non-domination. Specifically, I'll highlight 3 ways in which non-domination is better equipped to assess international research transactions, given the particularities of the relevant background conditions, the way in which background institutions are governed, and its ability to bring out important features of what is essentially a collective action problem. So, the liberal case for non-intervention. Arguments against regulation are grounded in 2 related claims. One is that the practical upshot of interference with research transactions is to ultimately deprive very needy communities of benefits to which they otherwise lack access, and that interference with such transactions constitutes a violation of community and individual autonomy, and therefore an unjustified form of paternalism. So, some LAEs argue that, quote, the determination of whether the benefits are fair and worth the risks cannot be entrusted to people outside of the population, no matter how well-intentioned. Moreover, disregarding the community's view about what constitutes appropriate benefits for them, insisting that a population must benefit in a specific manner, implies a kind of paternalism. Similarly, Alan Wertheimer defends what he calls the permitted exploitation principle, or the PEP, which states that if an otherwise exploitative transaction between A, the exploiter, and B, the exploited, will serve B's interests, all things considered, will not harm anyone external to the transaction, and if B makes a voluntary, informed, and rational decision to transact with A, then it would be wrong to interfere with such a transaction. Now, it's important to note that Wertheimer is not claiming that it is morally permissible for A to exploit B. He's making the much more limited claim that regardless of the morality or the immorality of the transaction, it is wrong to interfere with it on the grounds that it is unfair. So he says the PEP refers to the morality of regulating transactions and not to the morality of the transactions themselves. Now, the operant conditions in the defense of the PEP are again the voluntariness of the transaction and the resultant benefits to both parties, and in particular to the exploited party. Now, in another paper, I actually interrogate the claim that the regulation of research would undercut important benefits to needy populations, and I demonstrate that appropriately designed policy can ensure that financial incentives to conduct research in LMICs are maintained. So I'm going to leave that question aside, although it'll briefly come back up a little bit later. And in this paper, I'm going to focus on the idea that respect for autonomy demands non-interference with such transactions, and on the implicit claim that that the principle of respect for autonomy provides the appropriate framework for the assessment of international research transactions. Okay, so respect for autonomy. Although respect for autonomy is considered a central bioethical principle, there is little clarity or agreement with regards to what constitutes autonomy or its respect. The central value embodied in autonomy is something loosely like self-government or the authoring of one's life. Within bioethics and within research ethics in particular, this is generally unpacked via a negative and a positive component. The negative component requires non-interference and a lack of controlling influences, such as coercion, right? And the positive component usually refers to an obligation to foster autonomous decision-making, as via the disclosure of full information and ensuring the requisite conditions for self-determination. This positive-negative dichotomy mirrors that which characterizes competing conceptions of freedom. And my critique of respect for autonomy in this section borrows heavily from the parallel critique which Philip Pettit levies against positive and negative conceptions of freedom. So note first that the negative form of respect for autonomy seems to impugn all coercive interference with individuals' actions. If regulatory interference with international research transactions constitutes a violation of host community autonomy, that's because it is trivially true that any regulatory framework which governs or restricts transactions of any kind would constitute interference. In this case, other restrictions on research transactions would similarly impede autonomy as characterized in this way. Limits on permissible risk-benefit ratios, for example, also fail to respect this kind of negative autonomy by constraining individuals' abilities to engage in transactions which they might desire to enter into. Nevertheless, we insist that the benefits and risks associated with clinical research must be reasonably balanced. Other laws which impact international transactions and international research transactions in particular also violate non-interference, including the vast and complex network of global trade agreements, which are generally considered part of the free market, but which nevertheless function to restrict the kinds of transactions which individuals and communities and LMICs are able to enter into. Now, it seems unlikely that LAEs want to condemn this entire global apparatus as autonomy limiting, but it is unclear on what basis they would distinguish between other regulations which restrict the ability of individuals and LMICs to enter into transactions with others, and transactions involving the hosting of clinical research, especially since that system of global regulation is largely externally imposed via practices of trade negotiation which are undemocratic and consistently dominated by the interests of wealthier nations. And I'll say more about that later. We should further question the value of respect for autonomy characterized as non-interference. As Pettit points out, one can be left alone entirely while nevertheless remaining in a position of great vulnerability to the arbitrary caprice of other individuals. Autonomy predicated on non-interference presupposes an ideal of the individual who is entirely self-sufficient and independent of her relationships with others, with some private domain over which she has independent control and from which she can exclude others except by mutual agreement. But this notion obscures the essential interdependence of all individuals, while simultaneously assigning privileged moral status to those who command a sufficient stock of resources to at least outwardly appear independent in this way. Meanwhile, those who are fully dependent on others for work or other basic needs are provided with a protected zone, which is essentially void of content. And this description better captures the reality for LMIC host populations, who without access to basic health care are dependent on research sponsors and are likely to autonomously consent to whatever recompense can be garnered, regardless of whether it approximates what would be offered in a more fair competitive market. On the other hand, it seems clear that LAEs are not complaining that restricting the terms of research agreements would somehow compromise the positive autonomy of LMIC communities. If LAEs were interested if LAEs were interested in the conditions for autonomy, the claim would need to be that in taking away the option to negotiate for a lower share of benefits, we are reducing the choice sets of communities in a way which impedes their capacity for self-determination. But all else equal, merely removing one option from the choice set available to an agent is not sufficient to deprive her of her self-mastery. Moreover, limiting the outcomes of research negotiations so as to ensure a greater share of the social surplus for host communities would seem to promote the conditions of autonomy, insofar as that compensation is necessary to fill gaps in the basic needs of community members. So respect for autonomy can't do the work that LAEs need it to do. It is trivially true that any regulation of research transactions would violate non-interference, but research transactions don't occur in a vacuum. And LAEs must explain why this particular kind of interference would constitute a more egregious violation of autonomy than other ethical limits to clinical research, like those which are grounded in the protection of research subjects or trade regulations which govern global markets. And promotion of the positive conditions for autonomy is clearly of value, but it isn't obviously violated by regulations which are targeted at improving the lot and in particular the share which goes to host communities. So what about this idea of non-domination? A more appropriate principle for the assessment of international research regulations is the promotion of non-domination. Domination consists of being in a position of subordination to external control, or the unrestrained and systematic ability of an individual or group to exert power over others in pursuit of their own interests at the expense of those subordinate to them. Non-domination is then the condition in which an individual is not subordinate to or subject to the arbitrary power of another party. Now, non-domination is a feature of relationships rather than a feature of individuals. One person dominates another when she has power over her in such a way that she can interfere with her actions without regard for her interests. Being dominated does not require that the dominating party actually interfere with the dominated. It consists merely in being in a particular kind of relationship of subjection to the arbitrary interference of other persons. Thus, respect for autonomy construed as non-interference is perfectly consistent with significant domination. A benevolent slave owner may never restrict her slave's actions, but that slave is nevertheless subject to her whim and in a constant state of vulnerability to arbitrary interference. On the other hand, being interfered with does not necessarily constitute domination, if that interference takes into account the interests of those who it affects. So the claim that I'm going to defend in the rest of this paper is that the promotion of non-domination is a better principle to protect host communities from exploitation, because it better reflects the nature of the relationships between host communities, research sponsors, and broader institutional structures in at least three ways. So first, it allows us to adequately capture the extent of host community vulnerability to the whims of research sponsors. It also allows us to consider global research relationships as situated within the context of the global economic system. And third, it captures relationships of interdependence across LMIC communities. So the ability to capture vulnerability and threat advantage. Non-domination adequately captures the extent of host communities' vulnerability to the whims of sponsors who would conduct research in their locales and on their populations. To suggest that non-interference with the voluntary negotiations of communities who lack adequate food, water, shelter, and access to medicines is equivalent to respecting their autonomy fails to consider important contextual features within which negotiations are situated. In a bargaining situation, one party's threat advantage is her relative willingness to contract if her proposal is not accepted. A party to a negotiation has a positive threat advantage when she stands to lose less than the other party if an agreement is not reached. The existence of threat advantage seems to be a defining feature of mutually beneficial exploitation. The fact that the exploiting party stands to gain less and can therefore more easily refuse to transact embodies the exploited party's vulnerability. Now, research transactions conducted in LMICs can instantiate particularly extreme threat advantage, given that hosting a clinical trial often represents the only means by which a community can gain access to basic health care or infrastructure. In such circumstances, absent regulations restricting the kinds of research agreements which can be reached, those communities can usefully be construed as dominated by research sponsors. Given host communities' drastic need for resources, sponsors are able to dictate the terms of interaction without consideration for the interests or priorities of those communities, because those communities will quickly race to the bottom with regard to the compensation they demand in exchange for research participation. The extreme inequalities underlying such transactions are background features captured by the notion of domination, while they are lost to an analysis grounded in a conception of respect for autonomy characterized as non-interference. Okay, global institutions and governance. Non-domination also allows us to consider global research relationships as situated within the global economic system. The focus of contemporary debates about exploitation on so-called transaction-specific fairness and the role of individual choices in negotiations obscures the background relationships which significantly determine the choices available to all parties involved. Global trade, and specifically international research transactions, occur within a complex system of global governance in which policies are dictated largely by organizations whose policy processes are non-transparent and undemocratic. The way power asymmetries are exploited in global trade negotiations illustrates that this domination occurs at a broader level, where policy decisions are made in ways which systematically disregard the interests of LMICs, subjecting them instead to the arbitrary power of OECD nations and the interests of multinational corporations. Promoting non-domination allows us to situate transactions within this institutional context and is capable of recognizing that mere non-interference is insufficient for dominated individuals and communities to protect their interests. On this account, domination occurs at two levels. Okay, so it's leveraged in individual negotiations where the details of research agreements are hammered out, but it's also at the level of policy setting in ways which sustain and even reinforce the potential for domination at the transactional level. Thus, the enormous disparities in resources and powers between states are at the roots of not only global relationships of domination, but also of individual relationships between contracting parties situated in those global relationships. Okay, the interdependence of LMIC communities. Finally, non-domination can be leveraged to explain the relationships of interdependence that adhere across LMIC communities. Throughout the paper, I have assumed that regulations can be structured to ensure fairer international research agreements without removing the financial incentives to conduct research in LMICs, and thereby bring benefits to those communities. However, even supposing that consistently applied regulation can be structured to maintain this financial incentive, there's a further concern that increasing the cost of conducting research in LMICs will reduce the number of trials that could or would be conducted, given limited research resources. Now, the promotion of non-domination provides two insights into this problem, which I think Respect for Autonomy is ill-equipped to recognize. First, because non-domination is a feature of relationships rather than of individuals, it recognizes that the autonomous activities of communities, or of individuals, have externalities which devolve onto outsiders. Just as communities exist in a context of interdependence with wealthier nations and corporations through an extensive system of economic interaction and governance, those communities also stand in interdependent relationships with one another. The transactions which one community enters into with other parties can both generate conflicts as well as contribute to collective problems that interfere with the ability of other parties to pursue their interests. So when one community is willing to host trials for a decreasing portion of the social surplus generated by research, they undermine other communities' bargaining power and reinforce the downward pressure on compensation, exacerbating the vulnerability of other communities to domination by research sponsors. Non-intervention cannot easily reflect the moral importance of these interrelations. whereas a framework which can account for such conflicts draws our attention to the need for effective means of coordinating the actions of multiple separate but interdependent communities. The second insight from non-domination is its emphasis on freedom not from interference, but freedom from interference which fails to adequately account for the interests of those who are affected. Recognizing the need for coordination, which takes the interests of host communities into account, again highlights the crucial importance of increasing the transparency and inclusiveness of global governance. One of the most valuable insights of liberalism is that individuals are in a position of epistemic privilege with regard to their own interests. Non-interference reflects this, since interference is presumed to come from those with little insight into the actual needs of those who are interfered with. However, non-interference, as we've seen, falls short on other dimensions. Non-domination, while it allows us to utilize regulatory structures to coordinate activities, does so in a way that embodies this key insight of liberalism by explicitly demanding that any intervention take adequate account of the interests of the affected parties. A crucial piece of this is ensuring the full involvement of the affected parties, host communities in this particular context, in the determination of the appropriate regulatory structures. So I'm just going to say some things to wrap up what I've said. Arguments against regulation of exploitative research transactions are grounded in the principle of respect for autonomy, cashed out as non-interference with voluntary transactions. But as we've seen, non-interference is unable to distinguish between permissible and impermissible forms of intervention, and moreover is predicated on a problematic ideal of the individual as fully self-sufficient. On the other hand, the principle of promoting non-domination better captures the value of agency for those not characterized by the robust individuality presumed by respect for autonomy. This framework also captures the vulnerability of host communities to global research sponsors who hold extreme threat advantage in bargaining, accurately portrays the situatedness of international research agreements within a system of global governance which is both largely externally imposed and which represents a discrete form of domination that is interrelated with and mutually reinforcing of transactional level domination. And it accounts for the interdependence of host communities acting within the same system of global trade. Finally, thinking about global research within the framework of non-domination demonstrates that research regulation need not violate LMIC self-determination if it is undertaken with the full participation and input of those who are affected. I will stop there. I've got a couple pages of references if anybody feels it.